Hey, what's going on, Facebook? This is George. I am just gonna wait a little bit and see if anybody joins. Um, I'm still gonna be talking anyway. You won't be able to shut me up. Not that anybody's trying anyway. Anyway, I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all able to stay sane out there protesting and at home, um, staying safe. Um, I just um, I just saw a tweet by San. I hope I get his name right. Sanjil Gupta. Hey, what's going on, Tony Ventura? Um, which basically said that yes, we are in phase one of reopening, but basically, I guess his tweet said, and I'm gonna post it to my Facebook page probably later on today. Um, he he said that people are waiting for the second wave of the coronavirus to hit when we are still in the first wave. So you know the death count right now is, I believe, at 115,000 people who have died from this virus, and it's not stopping. So we are in big trouble. You know, stay safe out there. Wear a damn mask when you go out, if you have to go out. Anyway, today is also Juneteenth, and I do want to wish everyone a somewhat happy Juneteenth, because it's a very important date of remembrance. Hey, what's going on, Charlie Sabatino? Nice seeing you here. Um, and I hope, for what it's worth. Marco, what's going on? Good to see you, dude. I hope you guys can hear me well. So just somebody give me a thumbs up that the microphone is working well, and that all my settings are correct. I think they are. Thank you, Marco. Appreciate that. So I was thinking about this video that I'm about to do today, which is entitled "The Show Preparation Episode 5." Um, and I started with episode 1, which was my current show, Into Proud, and episode 5, obviously, and I went through all the shows that I had done. And episode 5 now is my first show that I ever did on Broadway, where I ever had the chair. And I was wondering, how does that possibly go together with the Juneteenth celebration? But it's routed to the left channel. Used to be stereo. That's interesting. Let's see if that's how's this now. This should be the left channel. This is interesting. Marco Panacea just let me know that my mic is apparently only coming through the left side, which really should not be the case. How's this now? Let me know. This should be stereo right now. Or this should be stereo. No, this should be stereo. As I'm fighting with these settings. Interesting. Anyway, let me see. Let me turn this one off. Maybe that does something. Um, so I was thinking, like, how does my first show possibly have anything to do with Juneteenth? And still left side only. Sorry, Marco. I wish I could do something about that. Let me see if this is. How is this now? Because now I am only hearing it in my left side. Um, Let me know if this is any better. Um, yeah, sorry about that. So I was thinking, how does Juneteenth and Spring Awakening and what Spring Awakening represented for me, how does that, is there any kind of common ground? Um, and I'm jumping in the timeline of what I intended to say, but I guess what it represented to me, no changes. Okay, well then I'll switch it back over here because I was only hearing myself on my left ear. That was driving me crazy. All right, but coming back to to the significance, what Spring Awakening meant for me was, I mean, obviously it was a job. It was a steady paycheck, and in a lot of ways, it meant um, a certain amount of financial liberation, and that was a thing that was available to me. Um, in part because of Spring Awakening, because that show came around, and I was able to make a lot of money with it, and pay off. What did I have at the time? I had credit card debt. I was able to pay all of that off. I was able to pay off a tax tax debts that I had from being a freelancer. I was able to pay all of those off. I don't quite remember whether, when you get a weekly paycheck, you have taxes take. You can have taxes taken out. Hey, what's going on, Sadi? Good to see you. I don't remember whether I had uh, extra taxes taken out, or whether I just did the usual exemptions that I always claim. Um, Nevertheless, the 2 years and let's see, we ran for 2 years and like 3/4 of a year, so almost 3 years that we ran on Broadway. Um, those 3 years made it possible, again, close to 3 years, uh, to pay off a substantial amount of tax debt, and wiped all of that clean. It was gone. Um, yes, I was on a payment schedule, on a payment plan, but just the taxes that were taken out of my paycheck every week were at the end of the year made it possible for all of these debts to disappear. And for that, that was, I guess you could see that as somewhat of a you know a line that connects at least my Spring Awakening experience to the Juneteenth celebrations that are going on out there. Because, yeah, Spring Awakening for me was a big part of financial liberation, of getting out from under credit card debt and getting out from under tax debt. I hardly know anybody who doesn't have these kinds of debts. Um, but yeah, that it definitely helped me. So let me jump right in. Uh, it was my first show. It was my first show on Broadway. Um, Up until then, my background was firmly in jazz, firmly in pop rock and R&B, modern R&B. I had toured and recorded with Benny Golson, toured and recorded with Alexis Hightower, even though she asked me not to say that name, it just came out, sorry. And toured and recorded with Amel LaRue. Uh, and I'd also had done a pop tour with this Austrian artist by the name of Wolfgang Ambros, who is the German-speaking Bruce Springsteen. There you go. Started right around the same time as Bruce Springsteen started over here, but made a career for himself in German-speaking Europe. Um, so I had been on tour with him. I'd recorded with him as well. All this to say that I had absolutely no experience playing a show, uh, never mind a Broadway show, no experience holding down the chair. Um, my experience, what that was concerned, was limited to being a sub at the Lion King. Let's see, Spring Awakening started in 2006, and my first subbing job at the Lion King was in 2005. So not a lot of time. And I had also done, towards the end of 2005, I had done a tour of the musical Rent, which was entitled the World Tour because we went to Southeast Asia. And we did, I believe, 4 months in China, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. So very, very little, very limited experience. It was just no experience whatsoever. And while I was thinking about today's live video and I wrote out some notes, I also, at this point of no experience came up, and let's also just think about for a second of what that means. What does it mean to have experience playing a show, all right? Because nobody, at least nobody I know, or nobody that there's a world of different ideas about that. Um, what does it mean not to have experience? It basically you go into this building that has a very strict way of running business, okay, which is necessary. There are people who have very defined jobs that they have to do in a precise fashion every night, every day, and every night, because there is a certain amount of danger involved. Moving scenery around and getting people to one side or the other side of the stage on time, making sure electricity currents are correct. I mean, we had situations where people got shocked. I remember one sound guy of us, he got a shock and his shoulder popped out. He had bad shoulders, so we were over in the musicians area, and all of a sudden we hear screaming from the other side of the basement, and the sound guy's shoulder popped out because he got a shock due to a faulty wiring or whatever was happening. Old wiring. Let's not forget that these buildings are also very, very old. So to have experience in a situation like this means you know where to go, you know whom to ask, you know where are your lockers. Do you have lockers? Do you have a right to have a space? Okay, and is it okay to speak up and say, listen, this I need a little more space, or this is in my way, can this be moved? All of these things, all of these communications and needs need to be met. And of course, you try not to be a total asshole about it, but you do need to, have the courage of your own conviction and say, listen, I'm doing a job here as well. So with Spring Awakening, we had this very unique situation where basically the band had no experience whatsoever. We had, I think we were 6 people in the band, and 3 of us had previously done some subbing on Broadway, which was very, very little. I think between the 3 of us, maybe 3 shows, and that was it. Maybe 2 shows. And everybody else never had a chair on Broadway. So we were completely in uncharted territory, at least for us. And it was at the same time exciting, at the same time somewhat intimidating to figure out, okay, how do we do this? How I got the job, because that's a question that comes up very often. I got into playing this particular show via subbing. I had just come back from the world tour of Rent, and I was hanging out in New York. I was hanging out at the bitter end, and I bumped into Jeff Allen, the bass player. I told him that I had just done this tour, this musical theater tour, because that was also my first musical theater tour. And a couple weeks later, he called me and asked me whether, since I had done work in the musical theater world, would I be interested in subbing for him on this workshop. And at the time, it was just maybe 2 or 3 days. that he couldn't do due to scheduling conflicts. And of course, I agreed to it. I was happy to help him out. I was happy to do it. Um, and then his schedule changed, and I ended up doing the entire workshop. Um, and after the workshop, and that was that was the last workshop for Spring Awakening before it went to an off Broadway production. And that workshop was at Baruch College. I remember that. After the workshop, the creative team decided to ask me to do the off Broadway production, which was at the Atlantic Theater on 20th Street in Manhattan. And I was very happy. I was very happy to do it. I all throughout the off Broadway production, I was still working a day job. I was still doing construction during the day. Um, so basically, my day started very early. Get up, take a shower, go to the site. Um, I remember one of the very last construction jobs I had was here in Brooklyn, Brooklyn Heights, I believe, where we had to renovate a either one bedroom or two bedroom apartment at the promenade, and that included tearing out the old ceiling. This is plaster. This is like 120-year old building, so plaster walls, plaster ceiling. We did have masks. Nevertheless, we opened up the ceiling and basically you cut into the ceiling, you try to grab onto something and you start pulling it down. And sure enough, like everything that was in that ceiling for 120 years came, came crushing on top of me. So I was surrounded by dust, vermin droppings, dead rats, dead mice, more dust, more plaster, more wood, and all of that in my face. It was pretty nasty. It was one of the probably most nastiest experiences I've ever had. But all of that was going on during the day. Come 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my so-called work day would be done. I'd rush back home, take a shower, change, and go to the Atlantic Theater and play the show. And I was thrilled to do it. I was tired. I was totally tired and quite exhausted. Nevertheless, I was thrilled to do it. And I was also thrilled to do the combination because not to go into too much detail, but this was also coming at the end after doing that world tour. And before the world tour, I had done the construction job, and then I had to tell my foreman, listen, I'm going to be gone for 4 months, doing this tour. But when I come back, I'd love to continue working because it was steady pay. Um, and they were nice enough, he was nice enough to take me back in, which really meant a lot to me. So I was thrilled to do both. Okay, yeah, it was exhausting. It was a lot of work. It was partially dangerous, but I was thrilled to do both. So, and then we basically started at the Atlantic Theater, which is housed in what used to be a church. So you got these exposed brick walls all around you. The staging was a bare minimum. I thought it was very modern. I thought it was really quite awesome. There were partially audience members were on stage with us. The band was on stage. At the time, I was still playing a 4x10 cabinet and an Eden amplifier. The amplifier would routinely overheat because the Atlantic Theater, the theater, we were in the middle of a heat wave. And the theater's AC couldn't keep up, so it got really hot in the theater, and my amp was just not having it. So every now and then, The amp, the fan, the built-in fan of the amp would just jump into action, so you would get this coming from behind me, and I would basically just try to ignore it and make as if nothing was happening. So while the sound was happening, there's nothing to see here. Yeah. It was good times. So, what else do I remember about Off Broadway? I don't remember the audience reaction off Broadway, and that was probably partially due to working a day gig, and also still freelancing. I remember I had to take 1 or 2 shows off because I was doing the Atlanta Jazz Festival with Benny Golson. So while all this is going on, I'm still playing gigs. I'm still um, hustling. I'm still freelancing as much as I can. And So I don't remember the audience. I remember the audience coming, and I remember um, the house being full most of the time, or all the time, pretty much. Because from what I understand, from what people tell me, it was a big success off Broadway. Um, and I do remember the day when Ira Piddleman and Tom House came in, and presented to the company um, that the show would be going to Broadway, and that was a big deal. That was huge. So we were at the Atlantic Theater throughout the summer of 2006, and I think we closed uh, towards the end of July, beginning of August, or something like that. I know that after the off Broadway production, we recorded the cast album at Duncan's studio, which was housed inside his inside his apartment in Manhattan. Um, so that would have been now September of 2006, and I believe then towards the end of September 2006, beginning of October, we opened at the Eugene O'Neill Theater on 49th Street. And I do remember the preview period of Spring Awakening being um, the life of the show being on shaky ground. Um, and and I also remember why that was, because there was a lot of talk about the subject matter of Spring Awakening, which the musical, for those who don't know, the musical is based on a play by a German playwright. Hey, what's going on, Ruben Rodriguez? Great to see you here. It's based on a play by the German playwright Frank Wedekind. Play is called Frühlingserwachen. There you go. There's my German coming through. And in English it's Spring Awakening. In German Frühlingserwachen. Terrible. Nevertheless, I had to read that play in school in Austria, and I also got there was it was somewhat familiar to my life because I went to primary and high school monastery school, boys only, no co-ed. Uh, so I knew that life to a certain degree. You know, whatever transgressions there were not as pronounced as they are in the play, or at least I never experienced them. Um, Nevertheless, I did know that life very well, and so uh, we basically went into Spring Awakening uh, on Broadway, went into the preview period, and the audience was kind of coming, but not really as much as I guess people had expected. It being such a big off Broadway hit. And of course, the first thoughts of doubt were coming in. Uh, oh, maybe this is, maybe this should have been left on or off Broadway. Maybe this, should have been left small. Um, Maybe it's not the type of show for the Broadway audience. And I always found that somewhat strange, that whole thought. I thought that the show was really interesting. It was very modern. It had the universal appeal of talking about puberty and repressed coming of age, for which basically, has which we all have to live through. So I thought that was, a very universal theme. But there was also a good amount of sex being acted out, and that, of course, got everybody's attention. What did not get any attention whatsoever was that one of the main characters in the second act has a big number where at the end he takes a pistol, puts it in his mouth, and pulls the trigger and commits suicide on stage. And for the life of me, I will never understand why there was so much talk about the sex scenes this and the sex scenes that, and there was not one mention about a teenager being so desperate um, that he decides to off himself. Didn't get a mention. No media coverage, no nothing. Okay, so I thought that was just really strange. Hey Joey, what's going on? Yeah, glad to see you too, Leo. I'm glad that you like my German. There's not gonna be much more of it coming. No worries. So, um, but then the reviews came out, and the reviews were glowing, and all of a sudden the show was catapulted into the spotlight, and it became the event of the year. It was the new show. And for what it's worth, there was an interesting development, I guess, where it seemed that every generation sort of had its defining shows on Broadway. There was Hair, there was Rent, and then there was Spring Awakening. So between Rent and Spring Awakening, yeah, there were probably some uh, famous shows, some influential shows. I'm sure that there were. I wasn't playing any shows at the time, but Spring Awakening became that generation's Rent, and all of a sudden it was everywhere. It exploded. Yeah, so two shows. You're right, Saudi. Two shows that I played. I tend to play really happy shows. Okay, two shows that I played had suicides on stage, and one show, Lady Day, the main character dies. There you go. Happy stuff. Nevertheless, the reviews came out. Spring Awakening exploded. Okay, it ended up being a huge hit. It was nominated for, I believe, 11 Tony Awards. It won 8 of them, including Best New Musical, and it had already won all the off-Broadway awards that were out there. I was very happy to see Bill T. Jones win the Tony for Best Choreography. I believe that was his first foray into Broadway theater. I'm not 100%, but that was pretty remarkable. And he is a remarkable artist. And I got to see him rehearse with the cast a couple times. Our cast was extremely young. I think the youngest actress was 14 at the time. Um, and they were not necessarily they didn't they, because they were very young. They didn't necessarily have the years of dance training, under their belt that shows and that actors usually have. So Bill T. Jones came up with this choreography that just went beyond that. Whether you were a dancer or not, it was telling um, telling stories through movement, and I found that fascinating. As I saw a rehearsal of that, and at least to me, as not being a dancer and not being into choreography and not understanding the language all too well, I was able to get the artistic merits of that and be spellbound. So it was really fascinating. So let me just take a look at my notes. Well, I talked about a lot of these things. Um, so what equipment did I use while doing Spring Awakening? And that kind of goes now to the preparation part of the show. Like, how do you prepare for a show that consists of entirely original music, um, written by someone who I at the time had no idea who Duncan Sheik was. Um, I think he had his big hit, barely breathing, was happened in '96, which happened to be the same year that I moved to the States. So I just did not know who this dude was. And I had, I had hung out with Jeff Allen, his bass player at the time. So I had somewhat of an idea, and okay, this is a singer-songwriter dude, but that was all of my info on him. And I later had to kind of learn his influences and learn where he was coming from musically, um, to understand and to interpret his music. And that connection, by the way, is ongoing to this day. So um, the the note that basically came through the grapevine, um, was Duncan wants this to sound like a garage band. Um, so at the time, again, my only foray into playing shows was, based on an article in Bass Player magazine, um, about Broadway shows and what's required to do that. That was many years ago, and then I had this clinic by John Miller, about getting and surviving the Broadway gig, which kind of opened up my subbing life, so to speak. But again, no experience as to what to do now that the responsibility lies on you as the bass player to make this music happen. Um, which what kind of made the situation perhaps a little more difficult was that we didn't necessarily have charts for the songs. That was kind of not necessarily how Duncan worked. Um, Again, he was coming from a band perspective, from someone who plays in a band and plays with his own band, especially. And you don't necessarily always chart everything out. You play it and you hear it, and you find your grooves, you find your hooks, you find your lines, and you hope that works, and you kind of sometimes sculpt the lines depending on where the vocal melodies are, but that was kind of the background out of which the music for Spring Awakening came. So there were no charts as such. There was some very rudimentary, meaning lines of root 8 notes for some of the songs, but then for other songs there was absolutely nothing. Um, so we basically came up with a bunch of parts. And the note that Duncan sent through the grapevine was he wanted it to sound like a garage band, and my only reference for that was the band Husker Du. anybody who's not familiar with them, check them out. Huskadu, I'm still a big fan. They don't exist anymore, but I believe that the main songwriter, his name is Bob Mould. He is still active. I am not sure whether the other two, the drummer and the bass player, are still active as musicians, but Bob Mould is definitely still out there. And I had the Warehouse album. I think it's called Warehouse album. It's a double LP at the time by Huskadu, and that was my definition, at least, of what a garage band perhaps sounded like. So there was, and I'll probably won't do it a lot of justice, explaining it right now. I urge everybody who is interested, check out the band so you can kind of hear the ferocity of the music and the energy that was coming through of their sound. It was fast. It was very melodic. It was loud. And it was very straightforward, meaning guitar, bass, drums. That was it. Okay. In the article in Bass Player Magazine that I mentioned earlier, one takeaway that I remembered was that all the bass players interviewed were talking about, okay, you need to have a jazz bass. You need to have a Fender jazz bass or an instrument that sounded like a Fender jazz bass, meaning something that's very versatile, preferably two pickups, 4 or 5 string, doesn't really matter. Depends on what the music calls for, but it needed to be a jazz bass because they needed a good sonic representation of what the bass can do. Meaning, with the jazz bass, you get a very even response throughout the frequency spectrum. And I decided I'm not gonna do that. I did not want to use a jazz bass at Spring Awakening. I thought, okay, well, this is supposed to sound like a garage band, and usually in garage bands you have not the best equipment, and if you have a good instrument, it's usually like a Fender P bass. So I brought in my Precision, my old 63 Precision, and I played that throughout the off-Broadway production of the show. And while we were still in rehearsals for the workshop at Baruch College, Duncan decided, he made an executive decision that he wanted upright bass in as well. So it was a P bass and an upright bass. The upright bass played arco and pizzicato, and that was it really. For the off-Broadway version of the show, we had an amp on stage with me, which provided, from what I could understand, pretty much all of the bass for the entire show, because they didn't necessarily put it in the house. And then for the Broadway production, if I remember this correctly, we substituted the amp with an Avalon U5 DI. Kept the line really clean, really simple. Basically, both basses went into an A/B switch, from the A/B switch into the Avalon to front of house and to the monitors, and that was it. It was very, very, very straightforward. And just to give you an idea of how inexperienced I was, I basically, once we were on Broadway, I had the great idea that, well, this is an awesome gig to check out stuff. So I would bring in, every week I would bring in different effect pedals, which of course would drive the sound people crazy. Which is something you're not supposed to do. One thing, and this kind of also speaks to, experience. One thing that I should have seen would be the parallels between doing a pop gig and doing a Broadway show or doing a show. And one of the things that are the same is that the product, meaning the show, the concert, needs to be the same every night. Okay, so it's not like a jazz gig. Um, it's not, the type of gig where you get to really revamp, reharmonize, um, flavor the music in different ways every night, and people would appreciate that and or react to that. It's not that type of situation, you know. And of course, me being me, I, at first I guess did not want to see that. So I brought in all these effect pedals, and I remember uh, playing the upright bass arco through a flanger at some point, which I thought sounded awesome, but my newbie bandmates were really upset with me. so, so be it. I mean, interestingly enough, nobody spoke up. Uh, Nobody ever said anything, but I got some really dirty looks. So, what can you do? Live and learn, I guess. But yeah, so the influences for my bass parts on Spring Awakening were, one huge part, Huskadoo, absolutely. One another huge part was the idea of it needed to sound like a garage band. Therefore, I used the precision. That also influenced the lines that I was playing, and of course, my background being coming from jazz and modern R&B and R&B. There was no way that I was not going to reference Jameson in the music. So you do have, with me being African American and playing um, my background, you have this flavor that comes in that perhaps somebody else with a different background would not have played. Um, and all of a sudden, my bass lines were more active. There was more movement going on. There was more outlining of chords. There was perhaps every now and then a hook that I would create. Um, and if I liked it, I would leave it in there because I got very little direction. Um, so there you have it. Those were the influences. And one other thing I should mention was uh, as we continued working on Spring Awakening, I also Duncan had dropped his latest album, which was called at the time, which was called White Limousine, and that came out, I believe, shortly before Spring Awakening started, or something like that. Anyway, he was still touring in support of that album, and I ended up playing in his band, and because I was playing in his band, I had to learn the album. So that became a big influence as well, and that became a big part of the sound of the lines that I came up with. So another thing was, uh, at the time I was heavy into Larry Graham, um, and I was listening to him pretty much nonstop, be it with Sly and the Family Stone or um, Graham Central Station. And there was something about uh, his way of playing these very straightforward quarter note grooves. I'm trying to think of an example to give you guys, but nothing comes to mind right now. Just listen to Larry Graham. I mean, the man is a legend. Um, Everyday people. There you go. That was, I guess, what I was thinking of. So the ferocity of his approach, the intense intense approach that he takes to playing the bass. Um, that was something that really influenced me, and somehow in my mind, I could I could make the connection between Larry Graham, the intense way of him playing uh, Husker Du, the intense way of that music, of how that music sounded, and and the imaginary garage band that was supposed to that was supposed to be Spring Awakening. So those were the three pillars, so to speak, uh, that influenced me. And then last but not least, one gentleman came into the production who changed a lot, and that was Simon Hale. Simon Hale, for those who don't know, is a fantastic British musician. I think his main instrument is keyboards. I might be wrong, but he was the orchestrator of the string parts for Spring Awakening. So he wrote the string parts for Spring Awakening. He also, I believe, had previously worked with Duncan either on the album Phantom Moon, perhaps, or even on White Limousine. I'm not 100%. Nevertheless, Simon came in and wrote string parts for Spring Awakening, and and that was huge. He had a very unique way of hearing music, um, and it his aesthetic together with Duncan's aesthetic influenced what we were doing. And That's if you hear the cast album of Spring Awakening, that's what you hear right there. You hear a big part of Duncan's aesthetic and a big part of Simon's aesthetic coming from the strings. And what the bass is concerned, you hear my parts, which of course were influenced by everything that happened before me and everything that was happening while we were playing it. So there you have it. That's today's video does not have a lot of playing or any of that. To be quite honest, I don't really remember a lot of those parts. Maybe I'll do some more research and relearn my own parts. I have to admit that I don't necessarily listen to my own albums or the albums that I recorded too much. I every now and then I go back and kind of check in, see, okay, I did this at this time, so maybe it's time to move on and get better. Oh, one thing I wanted to say, uh, which was a huge influence on me as well, and that was kind of, you see, Duncan wrote this music with sequences, and our drummer was triggering sounds, was triggering loops while we were playing to them. So there was an element of electronic music that that was part of the Spring Awakening sound. And in that music, what the bass is concerned, you don't necessarily always hear a lot of Jameson-like bass lines. You can, certain artists certainly do that, but very often you hear long held notes with a Moog sound, or with a Moog sound that has been manipulated, meaning sent through different filters, reverb, whatever. Um, so how for me the idea was that, okay, well, how can I sort of do something with that influence, with that information? Okay, there was definitely a strong information coming towards me that part of this sound was going to be electronic. Um, but here I am playing a P bass and an upright bass, um, two instruments that are, for lack of better description, very analog, not digital at all. They can be, made to sound digital. Nevertheless, I also wasn't that versatile to do that. Yeah. So basically, I thought that, okay, well, these all these long held synth notes, I can sort of substitute those, or I can make my arco bass sound like that. Um, and all of a sudden something clicked, right? So you had these sequences, drum loops, keyboard sequences that played, and then you had this, you know, drone of an arco bass sound underneath all of that. And at least to me, that made a lot of sense, and it spiced up the music and gave it some, yeah, an element that it perhaps didn't have before. But it was that combination of sounds of an arco upright bass together with, you know, sequenced um, harmonic content, with sequenced content coming from the drum chair. Um, so that was a big part of what I also added to the idea of it being a quote unquote garage band. Because, you know, a garage band in the 70s probably sounded different than a garage band in the 80s um, or, you know, in the 90s. Sadi wants to know, so you brought back the flanger for the upright? No, no, I did not. I did not. I left the flanger out. Basically, the after some time, hey, what's going on, Larry De La Cruz? Just see you that you're with us. After some time, sound department was complaining uh, about me to the MD, who, you know, rightfully so said, listen, they want it to be the same every night, so don't bring any more effects in. I had to go with that. You know, once the MD tells you what to do, that's your boss. Okay, so that's it. Mm. But yeah, this I did not bring the flanger back, but it is a great sound. So check it out. Check it out. Try playing an upright bass with a bow through a flanger. It sounds pretty awesome. So there you go. One thing that I wanted to point out, and I think that was very, very important in the creation of these bass lines, and therefore in the creation of the Spring Awakening sound. And that was the idea. And this, once again, those who know me know that I always reference my teacher, Professor Johannes Auersberg. And one of the big things that he taught was rhythmic accuracy. He was really, he was a taskmaster when it came to that. So, and that helped tremendously. It helped tremendously to have that in the back of my mind, to basically be like, whatever I'm doing, whatever lines I'm doing, whatever notes I'm pedaling in a rock song, whatever long notes I'm holding on the upright bass, I need to be, my rhythmic accuracy needs to be spot on. It needs to come in at the right time. It needs to go for the right amount of length. And it needs to cut off at the right time as well. So that was a big part of of uh, of playing this show, this particular show. Um, Spring Awakening changed everything for me. It was, as I said at the beginning, as we're getting close to the 1 hour mark, and I'm not gonna keep you guys any longer. Nevertheless, it changed everything for me. It was my first show. It was my first time um, being in the, I don't want to say being in the spotlight, but the show ended up being in the spotlight. The show ended up being the talk of the town, and to be the talk of the town in New York City is unlike anything else. Like, you've never experienced anything like that. You've never experienced walking down the street in Harlem, where I was living at the time, and having conversations with either friends, neighbors, whoever, and saying, "Yeah, I play a show. Oh, which show do you play? Oh, Spring Awakening. Oh, I hear blah 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 blah." Everybody knew about it. It's its own. It has its own energy. If and it's unlike anything else. So hey, what's going on, Alan? Oh shit, that was your first time on Broadway too. There you go. There you go. One of my subs just came joined us. My push ups, they had to learn the show. You know, they had to once again, like they had. I think I remember telling them, listen, there are three versions of this show. There are three recorded versions because we had a recording of the off-Broadway version. We had one of we had the cast album, and then we had a recording of the Broadway version, and and you know, I told him try to figure out, you know, all three of them. I actually sat down with all of my subs for that show, and we went song by song, and I showed them all the lines that I played. So that was, oh man, Alan, that's super nice of you. Appreciate that. Listen, this is my pleasure. Of course, I pick up the phone. And Joey wants to know, Joey Shoji, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, wants to know whether everyone asked me for tickets. Ha, that's a good question. Here is my take on that. Nobody asks you for tickets. Nobody in musician circles um, asked for tickets. Every now and then I would try to give tickets away and invite people to see the show. And there was usually and still to this day, this is ongoing. This has never changed for me at least. Um, the answer is always no. Nobody wants to take you up on the offer of, listen, I'd love to invite you to see this show. Nobody ever says yes to that. I don't know why that is. I have a sneaking suspicion that I have a sneaking suspicion of why people react that way, but interestingly enough, no. Nobody asked me for tickets, and every time I tried to give tickets away, nobody wanted them. So that was an interesting little, you know, dynamic, I guess. Um, so, uh, yeah, that was it. Spring Awakening changed everything for me. It was also my first experience of being in this theater environment, and with the exception of one girl in, and I call her a girl because at the time she was 14 and 15. One girl in the cast, one gentleman in the hair department, and one of the ushers. So it was one, two, three, with me, four. We were the only four black people in the theater, and that was it. Um, so that was my first experience of that. I was extremely proud to be a black musicians playing this rock show. Um, Up until then, or very often, there is, you know, there are extremely racist hiring practices happening on Broadway, on in the theater world, that at times um, manifest themselves by stereotyping musicians. And me being at Spring Awakening was very much going against the grain. Um, so I was extremely proud of that show. I was extremely proud of being there for that particular reason, for being a black musician in New York, playing a rock show, and not only playing a rock show, but playing the biggest hit that year, or, you know, a sort of life-changing moment for a generation of theater lovers. Um, that was a huge thing for me, and I was very, very proud that actually happened. Um, so that was yeah, that took some getting used to. Nevertheless, it happened, and as I said, like I was very proud of that show. That show was definitely somewhat of an underdog. Um, People once again, I'm flabbergasted by that. People were so afraid uh, about the sexual content of the show, and there was never even a mention of the suicide. You know, um, and then we also had strange audiences. I mean, I do remember one guy, we call him Tarzan, who would come in and sit on stage. We had audiences on stage with us, and Tarzan would come in, and didn't matter whether it was what time of year it was, spring, summer, fall, winter. The dude would always come in a tank top, and he was built. So he just loved the show and loved to be in a tank top, no matter whether it was winter outside or whether it was summer outside. Um, we had um, we had one patron expelled from the theater because he started taking his clothes off, and we had another patron expelled because he was masturbating while the show was happening. So all these things were, real. Joey wants to know whether I saw the Deaf West revival. No, I did not. I did not see the revival. I was working either Fun Home or Lady Day at the time. So I did not see the revival. Aside from the Broadway production of Spring Awakening, I did then sub on the tour. I subbed for Alan Hewitt, um, a number of shows on the tour of Spring Awakening, the first national, but that was kind of it. That was the extent of my involvement with that particular show. Um, in the meantime, I've done a lot of shows with from Duncan, um, be it out of town productions, workshops, recordings, whatever. Um, but Spring Awakening for me ended 2009 when the Broadway show closed, um, and I I'm not one to look back that much anyway, so I just didn't. As I said, like I was very very proud of that show. I think that it provided me with a sense of satisfaction that as a black musician I was playing that particular show. Um, it provided me with liberation, and again I want to make the circle back to Juneteenth, with liberation from credit card debt, from liberation from tax debt. Um, uh, it 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 made all of these items that much more important, and it made the idea of representation of black musicians in a pit, on stage, at the theater, that much more important, because it's otherwise, if people don't see you, they don't know you're there. You know. So, oh, thank you, Larry De La Cruz. I'm very proud of you too. And I am. I mean, I'm proud of you, and I'm proud to have met you. That means a lot to me. All right. Um, but those were my thoughts about the preparation that went into Spring Awakening. I hope um, I've been talking for a little over an hour now. I hope you guys can get some good information out of it. Um, I do believe that there's a huge difference between subbing on a show and having the chair of a show, and that difference goes to responsibility. Um, when you're a sub, you're responsible to sound like the chairholder. When you are the chairholder, you are responsible, at least the way I see it, to come up with parts that make this music work. Of course, taking into consideration um, the material that's there already. Sometimes stuff is really written out, but sometimes, as was the case with Spring Awakening, it was really not. And you kind of had to use your influences and use your your wits, and let's not forget, use your heart to come up with something that sticks, that is interesting to you, um, and therefore you make it interesting to the audience. Okay, um, and who knows, that might just, that little spark, that little point of interest might just influence the actors to sing a certain way, to get into a scene a certain way, to be more um, in command, in in more intense in their portrayal of the characters, in their acting out the songs, in singing the songs. So all of these, I'm a big believer that all of these little pieces are connected, and I do see, um, playing shows. Uh, I do see that as I see my role in playing shows as being this little wheel in an enormous machine, um, and that wheel needs to work really well. So um, yeah, those are my thoughts on the preparation that went into Spring Awakening. Check out Husker Du. I'm still a big fan of that band. I just the other day I listened to the entire album again, and I couldn't help but think like, man, this is one hit after the other, or one great song after the other. I don't know whether they were hits or not, but I loved that band. And listen to Larry Graham. You can never listen enough to Larry Graham. And be creative in seeing or in trying to interpret music that's usually, that might be seen outside, where you have to step outside of your box, outside of your comfort zone, right? um, as a bass player playing mostly analog instruments, all of a sudden I was confronted with electronic music, or the influence of electronic music in Spring Awakening. So I could have just said, okay, well, this, if you already got like some bass going on over here that's recorded, that's programmed, I really don't need to do anything. Or I could have just, which I ended up doing, pick up that pick up that line and pick up that thread, and say, okay, well, here's a low note on the upright bass. See if this works, and if this adds some texture and flavor to it. And gladly, the creative team at the time was open enough to do that. And I believe that, if your ideas are strong, and if they're, again, what Ausberg taught me, rhythmically um, well executed, chances are the creative team will appreciate that. And they went with my suggestions. There you go. Yeah. Uh, so, as I said, I hope that you guys got some good information out of this. I am going to, just going forward, I am going to perhaps play some sound examples for all of these shows. Um, and I'll always tag them with the show that they belong to. I urge everyone to follow me on YouTube, because a lot of these videos are going to, first of all, you can find all of the videos from the George's Bass Chat, all the live videos, you can find them on YouTube. And a lot of the videos now, I'm going to switch um, the the platforms basically over to YouTube, and perhaps only have samples here on Facebook. Because I'm trying to build out the YouTube page, and also trying to monetize that, if at all. So I want to say a big thank you to all of you for joining me for this hour and 10 minutes today. I hope you continue to stay safe and sane. I hope you continue to take care of yourself and everyone around you. And as I always say, be cool, be kind, and remember that we only have each other. So I'll see you next week. Later.